The morning light had a heavy, gray tone, the kind that made the glass buildings of downtown Atlanta look colder than usual. People moved quickly through the streets, clutching briefcases and phones, faces tight with impatience. Inside the glass doors of the Grand Republic Bank, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. At the far end of the lobby stood an elderly black man, maybe in his late 70s. His name was Mr. Gideon Cole. His posture was straight but weary, and the brim of his hat shaded eyes that carried years of quiet dignity. His coat was old, clean, but frayed around the sleeves. One of his shoes had a scuffed toe. He held a small, brown envelope in his hand, the kind old folks still used to keep papers and cash. He'd been waiting in that line for nearly 40 minutes. The line moved, then stopped, then moved again, always faster for others than for him. Every time someone glanced at him, they saw the same thing. Another old man who probably came to cash a small check or beg for assistance. The guards didn't even notice him beyond the surface. The young teller at the second window, Caleb Turner, a pale-skinned man in his 20s, looked up briefly and frowned. He had already decided Gideon was a time-waster. A look, a smirk, a roll of the eyes toward his colleague, silent communication that said, "This one's gonna take forever." The other customers shifted impatiently as Gideon stepped forward. He smiled politely, his voice steady. "Good morning, son. I'd like to make a transaction." Caleb gave him a once-over, leaning back slightly. "Aha! What kind of transaction?" "I'd like to withdraw from my account," Gideon said calmly. Caleb clicked his tongue. "All right. Do you have an account number?" Gideon reached into his coat, pulled out a slip of paper, and placed it on the counter. Caleb barely looked at it before sighing. "Sir, this looks like it's from an older system. This account number doesn't match our online database. Are you sure this is a valid account?" "Yes, I'm quite sure," Gideon replied softly. "It's been valid for over 40 years. The teller chuckled under his breath. 40 years? "Sir, this bank wasn't even around that long. Maybe you're confused with another branch." The words landed like stones. The people behind Gideon began to whisper. A woman giggled. Gideon stood still, not angry, just silent. "Maybe you should check again," he said, his tone calm but firm. Caleb shrugged. "I'm telling you, this account number doesn't exist. You'll need to contact the regional office. Or," he lowered his voice, as though doing him a favor, "maybe it's time you closed whatever account you think you had and started over." A few snickers echoed. The bank manager, Mr. Blake Carter, a tall white man in a navy suit, noticed the small commotion and walked over. His smile was courteous but cold. "Is there a problem here, Caleb?" Caleb straightened. "This gentleman's claiming he has an account from 40 years ago. Number doesn't even match our records." The manager turned to Gideon, that same polished smile never reaching his eyes. "Sir, perhaps you're mistaken. Many banks merged or changed systems. Do you recall which bank it originally was?" Gideon nodded. "Yes, it was Mid-South Trust before it became Grand Republic. I should know. I opened it myself." Carter raised a brow. "You opened it yourself?" Gideon looked at him with a small, unshakable smile. "Yes, I did." A ripple of low laughter spread among the nearby customers. A security guard stepped closer, arms crossed. Carter sighed and leaned in slightly. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean, but if you don't have valid documentation—" "I do," Gideon said, producing a folded paper from his envelope. It was yellowed but intact. An original deed, embossed with signatures. The bank's old seal glimmered faintly under the light. Carter took it reluctantly, glanced at it, then froze. His practiced smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered. "This Appears to be very old documentation, he said. I'll need to verify this with corporate. Gideon nodded. Take your time. As Carter walked toward his office, Caleb leaned over and whispered mockingly, Yeah, we'll call corporate. They'll tell you the same thing. This ain't monopoly money, old man. Gideon turned his head slowly, eyes calm. Respect is free, he said. The teller blinked, half smiling. Excuse me? Respect, Gideon repeated quietly. It costs you nothing, but losing it, that'll cost you everything. He didn't say it loud, but somehow the entire room heard it. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Behind the glass wall of his office, Manager Carter was on the phone, whispering fast. His expression changed, first confusion, then disbelief. He looked up at Gideon through the glass. The old man stood perfectly still. His patience was unnerving. There was something about him, the way he carried himself, the quiet assurance, that didn't fit the image of a helpless senior. After a moment, Carter hung up the phone. He stepped out of his office with a changed tone. Mr. Cole, he said slowly, would you mind stepping into my office for a moment? Gideon's eyes didn't blink. Of course. The whispers followed him as he walked past the other customers, his slow steps echoing softly on the marble floor. When the door closed behind him, the atmosphere in the bank shifted. The security guard looked uneasy. Caleb bit his lip. Inside the office, Carter swallowed hard. Sir, I've just spoken with the regional board. They confirmed something I didn't expect. Gideon remained silent. It seems you were one of the original investors when this bank's parent company merged 38 years ago. The account you mentioned, it's still active. In fact, he looked down at the computer screen, voice trembling slightly. It holds over $50 million in equity. Silence. The air seemed to tighten. Gideon didn't flinch. He simply said, I told you it was valid. Carter stammered. I deeply apologize, sir, for the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, Gideon echoed, almost as if tasting the word. Yes, that's what you call it when a man gets judged before being heard. Carter's throat went dry. Sir, if you'd allow me, we'll assign a private banker immediately. That won't be necessary, Gideon interrupted softly. What will be necessary is retraining your staff on how to speak to people, all people. He rose slowly, pocketed his envelope, and straightened his coat. Now I'll withdraw what I came for. Carter nodded rapidly. Of course, sir. Absolutely. Moments later, as Gideon stepped out of the office, the bank was silent. The same people who'd whispered now stared in disbelief. Caleb's smirk had vanished. Gideon approached the teller window once more. Young man, he said gently, I believe you owe me a transaction. Caleb swallowed. Why, yes, sir. Right away, sir. The old man leaned in slightly, his eyes steady. And an apology. Caleb's voice cracked. I'm sorry, sir. Gideon nodded. Good. Now you'll remember that respect is worth more than any number on a screen. He picked up his receipt, turned toward the doors, and walked out into the cold sunlight. The sound of his cane tapping against the floor echoed long after he was gone. Outside, he paused, took a deep breath, and smiled faintly. Not from pride, but from peace. He whispered under his breath, some lessons are taught in silence. The walk from the Grand Republic Bank to the bus stop felt longer than usual, though Mr. Gideon Cole's steps were steady. The morning rush had faded into the low hum of midday. Cars hissed past on wet asphalt. A drizzle had begun, soft, almost respectful, as though the city itself knew something had changed. He didn't rush. He never did. Each step was a reminder of time, how long he'd walked through it, how much he'd seen people change, yet stay the same. Across the street, a young boy in a school uniform stared at him, curious. Gideon smiled faintly, tipping his hat. The boy waved shyly back. The small gesture warmed something inside him that the bank's coldness hadn't managed to touch. He reached the bus stop and sat. The wooden bench creaked under his weight. He looked down at his reflection in a puddle. The wrinkled lines across his face told more stories than most books ever could. And behind those eyes lay a memory that had slept too long. 40 years earlier, Gideon Cole had been a young accountant, one of the first black men to hold an executive role at Mid-South Trust, a small but ambitious community bank. He'd worn crisp suits then, and dreams larger than any building downtown. He had a wife, Naomi, and a little boy named Reuben. They lived modestly, but they were happy. Gideon believed in the power of fairness, in numbers that balanced, in deals that helped people rise. But that world didn't stay kind. The boardroom had been a cold place for a man like him in the 1970s. When the merger talks began with a larger corporation from New York, he had been the one to spot the hidden clause, the one that would erase the community programs, the local accounts, the very soul of the bank. He'd stood his ground. "This merger will destroy what we built," he had said. The chairman, a sharp-eyed man named Howard Flint, had smiled politely and told him, "Mr. Cole, this is progress. If you can't keep up, step aside." He didn't step aside. He refused to sign the merger papers until they added protections for small clients. His insistence caused weeks of delay. Eventually, the board conceded just to move the deal forward. When the merger completed, Gideon found himself promoted to a silent position. Advisory, no voice, no votes. It was their way of removing him without scandal. He accepted it quietly. But what they didn't realize was that part of his compensation included company equity. Stock that everyone assumed would become worthless. Didn't. Over the decades, Grand Republic grew into a banking empire. His forgotten shares multiplied 1,000-fold. He never touched them, never bragged, never even told his son. Instead, he lived simply, teaching at a community college after retirement. His wife passed, his son moved abroad, and Gideon's world became smaller, but his principles never changed. A horn blared, breaking the memory. The bus arrived. Gideon climbed aboard, tapping his transit card. The driver, a cheerful white man with a gray beard, greeted him. "Afternoon, sir. You keeping dry?" "Trying to," Gideon replied with a smile. The bus rumbled through the city. As it turned a corner, Gideon saw something through the window. A familiar name on a silver plaque. Carter and Associates, Financial Consulting. He recognized the last name instantly. Blake Carter, the same man who'd humiliated him that morning. Gideon's eyes narrowed just slightly. Fate had a peculiar sense of timing. Later that evening, Gideon sat at his small kitchen table. The room was neat but old-fashioned. Floral curtains, a ticking clock, framed photos on the wall. One photo showed Naomi holding baby Reuben, both smiling at the camera. Another showed a group of men in suits, the original Mid-South board, decades younger, filled with ambition. He opened a leather-bound ledger. Inside were handwritten notes, figures, and an envelope marked Board Minutes, 1982. He hadn't looked at it in years. He unfolded one paper and read the signatures. Howard Flint, Charles Rowan, Gideon Cole, and then a fourth name scrawled faintly at the bottom, B. Carter, Junior Associate. His eyes hardened. So Blake Carter wasn't just some random manager. He was the son of the man who once tried to destroy everything Gideon built. He closed the ledger carefully. "So that's how history repeats itself," he murmured. He rose, walked to the window, and looked at the city lights beyond. He'd always believed revenge was a fool's game, but justice, when guided by patience, had its own rhythm. The kind that didn't need anger, only timing. And time, after all, was the one thing he had mastered. 2 days later, Gideon returned to the bank, this time not alone. With him walked Raymond Pierce, a tall man in a gray suit, his expression sharp and unreadable. Raymond was one of the country's most respected corporate attorneys, and Gideon's former student. They entered together. The same guard who had ignored Gideon before stood straighter now. The same customers turned their heads. Caleb, the teller, froze. His mouth went dry. The old man's calm face hadn't changed, but everything around him had. "Good morning," Gideon said pleasantly. "Is Mr. Carter in?" Caleb hesitated. Yes, sir, but tell him Mr. Cole is here, and that it's about the merger archives." The young man scurried off. The moment he disappeared, Raymond turned to Gideon. "You're sure you want to do this personally?" Gideon smiled faintly. "I'm too old to hide behind lawyers, son. Let him hear it from the man he disrespected." Moments later, Carter emerged from his office, face pale. "Mr. Cole, I didn't expect." "Of course not," Gideon interrupted gently. "That's the thing about assumptions. They never do." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You might want to clear your schedule today. The past is calling." When Blake Carter led Gideon and Raymond into his office, the air felt heavier than before. The blinds were drawn now, the city's light filtered into thin lines that cut across the floor like bars of a cage. The memory of his arrogance 2 days earlier hung there, invisible but thick. Gideon set his brown envelope on the desk. "You remember this?" he asked. Carter nodded uneasily. "Yes, sir. That's the document you brought last time." "Good, because it's only part of the story." Gideon sat, resting both hands on his cane. "You told me to contact corporate. I did. They sent me everything I ever signed, board minutes, stock ledgers, merger filings. Your father's name is all over them." Carter blinked. My father?" Gideon nodded. "Howard Flint may have been the face of that merger, but your father was the architect behind the shadows. He's the one who buried clauses to cut community programs, the one who stripped the employees of their pensions, the one who tried to erase me from the records." Raymond slid a folder across the table. "We found copies in the state archive. Mr. Carter, these are your father's signatures. Legally, they're still attached to pending obligations that your bank never fulfilled." Carter picked up the papers, hands trembling. "I didn't know. I swear. I had no idea." Gideon's tone stayed calm. "You didn't need to know. You only needed to learn not to treat others as less." He tapped the desk lightly. "Your father once told me I was standing in the way of progress. Maybe he was right. Maybe progress just needed someone to remember where it started." Raymond leaned forward. "Here's the issue, Mr. Carter. Those unfulfilled obligations tie your branch to over $2 million in unredeemed community trust funds. If this goes public, your bank will face an investigation." Carter looked from one man to the other. "What do you want from me?" Gideon's eyes softened. "I don't want money. I want restitution, real restitution. Reopen those programs. Fund the small business initiative this bank promised 40 years ago. And make sure every person who walks into this building, no matter how they look, is treated with dignity." For a long moment no one spoke. Then Carter exhaled and nodded slowly. "I'll make it happen." Gideon rose, taking the envelope with him. "I'll be watching, not to see you fail, but to make sure you remember." When they left, the employees in the lobby turned to watch again. Gideon paused by the teller window. Caleb stood there, stiff and pale. The old man looked at him and said quietly, "The measure of a man isn't how he speaks to those above him, but how he listens to those he thinks are beneath him. Caleb swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Gideon nodded once, then walked out into the afternoon sun. Chapter 4. Echoes of What Was Owed. That evening, Gideon returned to his modest house. The sunset bathed everything in gold. On the table lay a stack of letters from years ago, thank you notes from students, holiday cards from neighbors. He added the day's receipt from the bank to the pile. He brewed tea, sat by the window, and listened to the ticking clock. For the first time in years, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a circle closed. But peace never lasted long for Gideon Cole. 2 days later, a black car stopped outside his home. Raymond stepped out first, holding a newspaper. The headline read, Grand Republic under investigation for historic fund misuse. Gideon sighed. So Carter couldn't keep his word. Raymond handed him the paper. He started the reforms, but someone at corporate leaked the documents. They're trying to pin it all on him. And now the board wants to meet you. Me? They think you orchestrated this. Gideon looked at the horizon. Maybe it's time they heard my side. He arrived at the corporate headquarters downtown. A marble tower filled with polished suits and nervous energy. Reporters were camped outside. Cameras flashed as the old man stepped through the revolving doors. Inside, a young assistant led him to a glass conference room. 10 executives sat around a long table. At the head was Evelyn Grant, the current CEO, a woman in her 50s with silver blonde hair and calculating eyes. Mr. Cole, she said smoothly, your name appears in some very old documents connected to our company. You've caused quite a stir. I didn't cause anything, Gideon said calmly. The truth simply woke up. Grant smiled thinly. Be that as it may, the press believes you're seeking compensation. We're prepared to offer a generous settlement in exchange for silence. Gideon chuckled softly. Silence? You think that's what this is about? He leaned forward, voice low. I don't need your money. I already own part of this bank. You just forgot I existed. One of the board members muttered. This is absurd. Gideon opened his envelope again and laid the original share certificates on the table. You might want to read the fine print before you call me absurd. Evelyn Grant's face drained of color as she scanned the paper. The signature of the founding chairman, sealed and notarized, glared up at her. Legally, Raymond said, that makes Mr. Cole a minority shareholder with voting rights. He can request an internal audit. The room erupted in murmurs. Gideon sat back, calm as ever. All I've asked is integrity. If that's too expensive, then this institution's wealth means nothing. Grant finally nodded. We'll cooperate. Good, Gideon said, standing. Then maybe, at last, we can make this bank worthy of the people it once forgot. He left the building to find a small crowd gathered outside. Journalists, onlookers, and a few who recognized him from the first story that had already begun to spread online. Elderly man exposes corruption at major bank. He didn't speak to cameras. He simply raised his hat, smiled faintly, and disappeared into the afternoon crowd. The following week brought storms. Not the kind that darken skies, but those that brood inside boardrooms, headlines, and restless hearts. The city seemed to pulse with Gideon Cole's name. Television anchors debated whether he was a hero or a troublemaker. Some hailed him as the conscience of the community. Others whispered that he was a man dredging up ghosts for attention. But Gideon stayed silent. He had said what needed saying. The rest was wind. Still, when Raymond called that evening, urgency edged his voice. They're holding an emergency board meeting tomorrow, Gideon. They're going to try to invalidate your shares. Gideon leaned back in his worn leather chair, his old cane resting across his knees. They're welcome to try. I'm serious. They've hired a legal team that specializes in corporate reversals. They'll claim the merger nullified your ownership decades ago. And what do we have? Raymond's tone hardened. Proof they didn't follow their own protocols when merging. The same oversight that erased you also voided half their current filings. If we push this, we could bring down the entire bank. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. No, Raymond. That's not what this is about. I don't want to destroy them. I want them to rebuild the right way. Raymond sighed. Sometimes, you can't rebuild without tearing down the rot first. Gideon looked toward the window. The streetlights glowed faintly through the drizzle. We'll see, he said softly. The next morning, the Grand Republic Tower was a fortress of glass and nerves. Inside the boardroom, tension hung like fog. The executives were seated already when Gideon entered with Raymond. Evelyn Grant sat at the head of the table again, her poise slightly cracked. Mr. Cole, she said, we've reviewed your documents. They are authentic, but they predate several corporate transformations. The board has voted to dissolve any claims associated with pre-merger shares. Raymond stood. You can't simply vote away federal securities law. One of the lawyers smirked. We can if the claims were never recorded digitally. These are relics, not rights. Gideon didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small brass key, and placed it on the table. That's the key to a safety deposit box, registered in 1974. Inside is the original notarized agreement, plus minutes from the founding board, all preserved under the original charter. I never trusted paperless systems. The lawyer's smirk vanished. Evelyn blinked. You kept it all this time? Gideon nodded. I was young once, and I believed promises meant something. A heavy silence fell. Then Raymond said, if you try to bury this again, we'll go public. And this time, it won't be just your stockholders reading. Evelyn looked at Gideon with something almost like respect. What do you want? He met her gaze evenly. A written commitment to restore the community trust, reopen the scholarship fund, and reinstate the small business grants this bank owes. I'll sign a non-disclosure in return. One of the older board members scoffed. You're bargaining with ghosts, old man. Gideon smiled faintly. Ghosts built this city. The least we can do is honor them. Evelyn exhaled slowly. You'll have your commitment, Mr. Cole. After the meeting, Raymond caught up to Gideon near the elevators. You could have taken them for millions. Why stop there? Gideon turned the brass key in his palm. Because sometimes, justice isn't about winning. It's about remembering who you were when they tried to forget you. They rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened to the lobby, a small group of employees stood waiting. They didn't say much, just nodded quietly as Gideon passed. But in their faces, he saw something he hadn't seen in decades. Respect born of understanding, not fear. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world smelled new. 2 weeks later, news spread that the Grand Republic Bank had announced a new initiative, the Gideon Cole Foundation for Financial Equity, dedicated to community investment and fair access to credit. Reporters wanted interviews. Cameras followed him for days. But Gideon kept declining. When Raymond finally asked why, the old man chuckled. I didn't do this to be seen. I did this so others could finally be. He walked down the same street where, weeks ago, a teller had looked at him like he didn't belong. This time, people stopped him, not to pity him, but to thank him. A young mother approached, holding her child's hand. Mr. Cole, she said shyly, they approved my business loan. They said your name made it possible. Gideon smiled. Then make it count. Build something that lasts. That night, he sat at his desk and began writing a letter addressed to the bank's board. To those who once forgot me, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because anger is a chain, and I've carried it long enough. Let this be the last debt between us. Do right, and remember, a man's worth isn't in his balance sheet. It's in the balance he brings to others. Gideon Cole. He folded the letter neatly, sealed it, and placed it beside the brass key. Then he turned off the light and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the city hummed, a steady rhythm of life moving forward. For the first time in years, Gideon felt that rhythm as his own. Months later, the renovated community branch opened its doors again, with a plaque by the entrance, dedicated to Gideon Cole, who reminded us that integrity has no expiration date. Children played outside. The same teller, Caleb, now served as branch supervisor. He looked older, quieter, but lighter too. When the ribbon was cut, a breeze swept through the crowd, scattering flower petals across the marble floor. Raymond looked up instinctively, half expecting to see Gideon there, leaning on his cane with that knowing smile. But the old man had chosen not to attend. He was sitting at home instead, watering his garden, listening to the soft sound of wind through the trees. He didn't need to be there. His story was already written, in bricks, in change, and in the people who finally understood the lesson he had spent a lifetime teaching. And somewhere deep inside that bustling bank, amid the noise of new beginnings, a single brass key lay in a glass case, engraved with the words, "Legacy is not what you keep, it's what you leave unlocked." The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the week. Gideon Cole sat on the small porch of his house, rocking gently in his wooden chair. A single lantern flickered beside him, casting long shadows over the familiar wooden floorboards. As he stared at the quiet street, his mind drifted decades back, to a time when the world was different, yet cruelly the same. Gideon was 16, tall for his age, wiry, with sharp brown eyes that seemed older than his years. He had grown up in the shadow of downtown Atlanta, in a neighborhood that thrived on small victories and survived on resilience. His mother, Lillian, worked as a housekeeper, often cleaning offices late into the night. His father, Samuel, worked at the train station, guiding travelers from platform to platform, carrying the weight of their stories and their expectations. Gideon often accompanied his father to work. The whistle of the trains and the hiss of steam fascinated him. But it wasn't the mechanics that captured his imagination. It was the people. Wealthy businessmen in their polished shoes, clerks with neat hair, office ladies with precise handwriting. He observed their demeanor, their mannerisms, how the world seemed to bend slightly for them simply because they fit a certain image. And yet, for every polite nod to someone of privilege, he saw a scornful glance directed at his mother, at himself, at anyone who didn't belong. He remembered the day clearly. A bank teller had refused to let Lillian open a savings account for her meager paycheck. "We don't serve here for people who can't maintain a balance," the woman had said, her words sharp and dismissive. Lillian had smiled politely, collected her papers, and walked out. But Gideon had seen the hurt, the quiet humiliation, and it burned into him. That night, he vowed something quietly but with all the force of youth. "One day, I'll build something that belongs to everyone. Something that doesn't judge the color of your skin, the size of your account, or the look of your shoes. One day, I'll make them remember dignity." School days and early lessons. Gideon worked hard. He excelled in math and logic, often staying late at the local library, poring over textbooks older than him. Teachers noticed his brilliance, but some doubted his potential simply because of the neighborhood he came from. He learned to ignore whispers, to treat discouragement as a puzzle to be solved rather than an obstacle. By the time he entered university, he had earned a scholarship to study finance. It wasn't easy. He worked nights, cleaned classrooms, tutored younger students. Each dollar he earned came with a lesson, that labor and persistence carried value beyond what any bank could ever quantify. In his sophomore year, Gideon met Elias, a young man from a wealthy family with charm and confidence, yet an openness Gideon didn't expect. They studied together, debated fiercely, and despite coming from opposite worlds, developed a mutual respect. Elias would later become an ally in Gideon's efforts to navigate the early, treacherous days of the banking world. At 22, Gideon landed his first job at Mid-South Trust, a small community bank. He was one of the few black employees in a mostly white office. The first weeks were full of subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices. A manager once told him, "We need someone to represent the neighborhood on the payroll sheets, but don't expect real influence." Gideon swallowed the sting, learning that the world often tested character before talent. He kept meticulous records, noticed patterns, and found inefficiencies no one else had the patience to see. Within a year, he was promoted to assistant accountant, a small victory, yet one that whispered of a larger potential. He began saving, investing quietly, always careful. Every rejected loan, every dismissed suggestion, every condescending remark fueled his resolve. He didn't respond with anger. He responded with strategy. The pivotal moment came when he uncovered a scheme by a senior executive attempting to reroute funds from community programs into speculative investments that benefited the board personally. Gideon spoke up, armed with spreadsheets, records, and logic. The executive scoffed. "You're young. You don't understand how business works. Don't waste your time with ethics." But Gideon didn't relent. His reports were irrefutable. The board eventually removed the corrupt executive, and Gideon was quietly recognized, but never publicly. It was a taste of victory, tempered by the knowledge that the system was often blind to the merit of the marginalized. From that day on, he vowed not only to rise but to create institutions where those without privilege would never be dismissed. Gideon's journey from assistant accountant to minority shareholder took decades. He invested, calculated, and waited, never boasting, never complaining. By his late 40s, he had quietly acquired shares in multiple banks, always with one goal: to ensure that one day he could restore integrity to the financial system he loved. Every decision he made was strategic. Every slight, every humiliation he endured, every overlooked opportunity became a lesson. And when the time came, when Blake Carter and the modern Grand Republic Bank revealed their arrogance, Gideon's patience allowed him to turn injustice into action. It wasn't revenge. It was history, measured carefully and executed with precision. As he sat in his rocking chair, the rain beginning to fall lightly again, Gideon realized that the fight was never about wealth. The empire he had built, the stock he had held, the community funds restored, they were all means to an end, dignity for those too often overlooked. He thought of the young boy he had waved to weeks ago. He thought of the mother who had received her loan. He thought of Caleb, the teller who now carried lessons of humility into his career. And Gideon smiled. His life, long and fraught with hardship, had come full circle. The city around him bustled with ambition and noise, but within that chaos, small victories, the restoration of justice, the teaching of respect, the demonstration that integrity endures, were enough. Because he had learned the most important lesson himself. Power is fleeting. Wealth is fragile. But the impact you leave on the lives of others is eternal. The brass key gleamed faintly on the table, a symbol of patience, foresight, and perseverance. And in that quiet moment, Gideon knew, finally, that his life's work was complete.